The silence of the Blackwood Forest was not empty. It was holding its breath, waiting for prey. 5 friends stepped onto the unmarked trail, laughing off the warning signs at the park entrance that spoke of disappearances. They sought adventure, but the towering pines seemed to lean inward, blocking the sun like iron prison bars. Mark led the group, confident in his GPS, yet the signal had died an hour ago, leaving them blind. The air grew thick and humid, smelling of damp earth and something metallic, like old blood rusting on leaves. Jen was the first to feel the eyes on her back, a prickling sensation that warned her they were not alone. They joked about ghosts to mask their rising anxiety, but their voices sounded flat, absorbed instantly by the mossy ground without reverberation. It happened on the second day, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows. Sarah stumbled over a hidden root, her ankle twisting with a sickening crack that echoed too loudly against the trunks. She screamed for help, a sharp cry of pain that shattered the oppressive silence of the woods. Mark and Alex rushed to her side, but then everyone froze instantly. From the deep darkness of the trees, Sarah's voice called back to them. However, it wasn't a cry for help. The echo said, clear and cold, "Leave me here." The blood drained from their faces as they stared into the thicket. Sarah was still clutching her leg, mouth open in shock, having never spoken those words. The voice from the woods sounded exactly like her, but distorted with a malicious glee. It wasn't a reflection of sound. It was a correction. Wind rustled the leaves, sounding like whispered laughter surrounding them. Sarah begged them to move, but her eyes were fixed on the dark line of trees where her own voice had just betrayed her. The forest had spoken, and it wanted her to stay forever. Denial was their first defense against the creeping terror that wrapped around their hearts. Mark insisted it was a trick of the wind, a psychological game played by exhaustion and fear. They bandaged Sarah's ankle and forced themselves to keep walking, but the atmosphere had shifted permanently into something hostile. The birds had stopped singing, and the insects fell silent, leaving only the sound of their own ragged breathing. Every snap of a twig sounded like a heavy footstep following them closely. Jen whispered that they should turn back, but the path behind them seemed overgrown, as if the forest had closed the door behind them. The echoes started again, softer this time, weaving through the branches. They heard fragments of conversations they hadn't had yet. Alex heard himself arguing with Mark about the direction, minutes before he actually spoke the words. It was as if the woods knew their future and were broadcasting it through the trees. The air grew colder, biting at their exposed skin. They realized they were not navigating the terrain. The terrain was navigating them. The trees seemed to shift positions when they blinked, closing the gap between the trunks. They were being herded deeper into the heart of the darkness, away from safety. Night fell like a heavy curtain, swallowing the little light that remained. They decided to make camp, huddled together around a small fire that struggled to burn in the damp air. The flames danced wildly, casting shapes that looked like human figures standing just beyond the light. That was when they heard the other voices. These were not their own echoes anymore. They heard a woman crying for her children, a voice they recognized from a missing person poster at the park entrance. Then a man begging for water. The forest was a graveyard of sounds, replaying the final moments of those who had vanished before them. Tom covered his ears, screaming for it to stop, but the voices were inside his head now. The fire flickered and dimmed, though no wind blew. Shadows stretched toward them, elongating like fingers reaching for warmth. Sarah whispered that the trees were hungry, that the echoes were bait. They weren't just hearing the past. They were being invited to join it. The darkness pressed against their backs, suffocating and heavy. Sleep was impossible when the woods were whispering your name. By the third morning, exhaustion had turned into pure paranoia. They hadn't slept, and their eyes were red rims of fear. The forest looked different in the gray light. The trees seemed to have faces carved into the bark, watching them with hollow eyes. They tried to hike faster, but the trail looped. They passed the same twisted oak tree with a red ribbon tied to it 3 times. Mark checked his compass, but the needle spun wildly, useless. The echoes were louder now, overlapping each other in a cacophony of despair. They heard their own voices saying goodbye to their families, conversations that hadn't happened yet. Jen started crying, convinced they were already dead. The air smelled of rot and decay, stronger than before. It was the scent of old graves being opened. Sarah's ankle was healed, but she walked slowly, as if something was pulling her back. The group dynamic fractured. Accusations flew about who was leading them astray. The forest fed on their conflict, amplifying their anger through the trees. They were no longer friends. They were prey trapped in a cage of wood and leaf. The breaking point came when Alex heard his own voice call out from the darkness, telling him to kill Mark. He turned around, eyes wild, holding a sharp rock. Mark backed away, hands raised, shouting that it wasn't him. The echo laughed, a sound that was purely human and purely wrong. It mimicked the sound of their laughter from the first day, but twisted into mockery. They realized the forest was learning them, studying their bonds to break them apart. Jen tried to intervene, but her voice was stolen mid-sentence, repeated by the trees with a sinister tone. "She knows," the echo said. "She knows what lies beneath." They didn't know what lay beneath, but the fear was absolute. They started running, abandoning their packs, abandoning logic. The branches whipped their faces, drawing blood that smelled sweet to the earth. The ground felt soft, like flesh rather than soil. They were running through a living organism that was digesting them slowly. The path ahead glowed faintly, a false hope luring them forward. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs felt like lead. The trees blurred into a green tunnel of violence. Every step was a battle against roots that tried to trip them and branches that tried to grab their hair. The echoes were screaming now, a chorus of hundreds of voices demanding they stop. "Stay!" the forest roared. "Become part of us." The sound was physical, vibrating in their chests, making their teeth ache. Sarah fell behind, her breathing ragged. When Mark turned to help her, he saw something standing behind her in the shadows. It looked like Sarah, but taller, with limbs too long for a human body. It waved at him. He blinked, and it was gone. Sarah claimed she saw nothing, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. They burst through a final wall of thorns, tearing their clothes and skin. The air changed suddenly, becoming clean and free of the metallic scent. They had found the edge. The road was visible, paved, and real. Relief washed over them, but it was cold and hollow. They collapsed on the asphalt of the parking lot, gasping for air. Cars were parked nearby, normal and mundane. A park ranger vehicle was visible in the distance. They had made it out. They hugged each other, crying with relief, thanking God for their survival. The sun was shining brightly, birds were singing normally. Felt like a nightmare that was finally over. They counted their belongings, checking for losses. Everything was there except their sanity. Mark looked at the group, doing a head count to ensure everyone was safe. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Wait, he counted again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There were 6 people standing in the circle. They stared at each other, confusion turning into horror. Who was the extra person? They all knew each other for years. There were only 5 of them who entered the woods. The 6th person stood quietly, smiling softly, wearing clothes identical to Jen's. Jen screamed, pointing at the duplicate. The duplicate smiled wider, showing too many teeth. The real Jen backed away, trembling. The group looked between the 2 Yents, unable to distinguish them. The duplicate spoke, its voice perfect, without the distortion of the woods. "I made it out," it said calmly. The real Jen shouted that she was the real one, but her voice sounded thin and fragile. The forest behind them was silent again, holding its breath. The duplicate stepped forward, placing a hand on Mark's shoulder. He didn't pull away. The trees behind them seemed to lean forward, waiting. The real Jen realized the truth. The forest didn't let them leave. It copied one of them to keep the group complete. The real one was left behind in the woods, screaming silently among the trees. The duplicate was the vessel sent out to spread the infection. The road stretched out before them, but it looked different now, like a path leading nowhere. The ranger vehicle approached slowly, the officer stepping out with a clipboard. He asked if they were okay. The duplicate Jen answered for the group, her voice charming and normal. The officer didn't notice anything wrong. He didn't see the terror in the real Jen's eyes as she faded into the background. The group walked toward the cars, but the real Jen stayed behind. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her mouth opened, but only leaves fell from her lips. Roots began to sprout from her feet, anchoring her to the asphalt. She was becoming part of the trail. The duplicate turned back once, winking at her. The group drove away, laughing about their scary trip. In the rearview mirror, the forest looked darker than before. Somewhere deep in the woods, a new echo was forming, waiting for the next group of hikers. The cycle continued. The forest was hungry, and it had just been fed. The end was not an escape. It was merely a transfer of ownership. The rain hammered against the windshield like frantic fingers trying to get in. Mark gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, as the GPS voice calmly suggested a route change. Recalculating, it said, though the tone sounded almost human, almost hungry. Emily slept beside him, unaware that they had just turned off the main highway onto a forgotten logging road. The trees here were ancient, their branches interlocking overhead to form a tunnel of suffocating darkness. The headlights barely penetrated the gloom, revealing trunks that seemed too close to the sides of the car. It felt like driving into the throat of a beast. Mark hesitated, wanting to turn back, but the rearview mirror showed only a solid wall of fog. They were committed now. The radio static grew louder, drowning out the music, replaced by a low hum that vibrated in their bones. This wasn't just a shortcut. It was a trap set long before they were born. The forest waited patiently, knowing that all roads eventually led back to it. The isolation was absolute. No signal, no help, just the engine humming in the void. As they drove deeper, the road narrowed inexplicably. The branches reached out like skeletal arms, scratching the paint with a sound that made Emily wake up with a start. She looked out the window, her breath fogging the glass, and saw faces in the bark. "Mark, stop," she whispered, but he couldn't slow down. The brakes felt spongy, unresponsive to his pressure. The trees were pressing inward, violating the physical space of the vehicle. Twigs snapped against the metal, leaving deep gouges that looked like claw marks. The air inside the car grew cold, despite the heater blowing full blast. Frost formed on the inside of the windows, obscuring their vision. They were being swallowed whole. The logging road was supposed to be wide enough for trucks, yet now it felt like a single lane barely fitting their sedan. The darkness outside pulsed, rhythmic like a heartbeat. Emily grabbed Mark's arm, her nails digging into his skin. She pointed at the woods, where shadows moved independently of the wind. The car was no longer a shield. It was a cage moving deeper into the belly of the wild. The sound of scratching became a constant screech, metal grinding against wood. They had been driving for what felt like an hour, but the scenery never changed. Then it appeared again, the twisted oak tree with the red ribbon tied loosely around its trunk. Mark slammed on the brakes, the car skidding on the muddy path. "We passed this," Emily said, her voice trembling. 10 minutes ago." They stared at the ribbon, fluttering in a wind they couldn't feel. Mark reversed slowly, watching the tree disappear in the rearview mirror. He drove forward again, counting the seconds. Exactly 3 minutes later, the same tree appeared in the headlights. The ribbon was tied in the same knot, frayed at the same end. Panic set in. They were stuck in a loop, a geometric impossibility on a straight road. Mark tried to turn the wheel sharply, but the car refused to deviate from the path. The tires seemed magnetized to the ruts. Emily checked her phone. No signal, no time. The world outside the car had become a record player stuck on a single groove, repeating the same nightmare over and over without end. The déjà vu was physical, making them nauseous with every rotation. Mark looked at the dashboard, and his heart stopped. The fuel gauge was dropping rapidly, the needle sweeping toward empty. Yet, the odometer hadn't moved a single mile. They were burning gas without going anywhere. How is this possible? Mark shouted, slamming his hand on the wheel. The engine roared louder, consuming fuel at an impossible rate. Time was also breaking down. Emily looked at her watch. The hands were spinning counterclockwise. Outside, the sky flickered. Night turned into a blinding noon sun, then back to midnight darkness in seconds. The sudden light revealed the trees were closer now. The sudden dark hid the things moving between them. They were losing energy and time simultaneously. The car was a battery being drained by the forest. Emily tried to open the door, but the handle wouldn't turn. They were sealed in. The air pressure dropped, popping their ears. The laws of physics were dissolving around them, replaced by the rules of the woods. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs, though they had eaten recently. The forest was digesting them, extracting every ounce of existence. Emily stopped blinking. She was afraid that if she closed her eyes, the world would change again. "Don't look away," she warned Mark, but human eyes need moisture. Mark blinked, and when he opened them, the tree with the red ribbon was 50 feet closer. He blinked again, and it was outside the windshield. The forest was closing the distance with every lapse in attention. The trees were not stationary objects. They were hunters stalking prey that couldn't see them move. Emily screamed as a branch tapped on the glass, right beside her head. There was no wind to push it. The wood was hard and cold like bone. They huddled in the center of the seat, trying to make themselves small. The car felt smaller too, the dashboard creeping toward them. The space inside was being compressed. They realized with horror that the loop wasn't about distance. It was about containment. The woods were tightening a noose around them. Every blink cost them safety. Every breath gave the forest more access. They were running out of room to exist within the metal shell. Mark floored the accelerator, the engine screaming in protest. The wheels spun, throwing mud, but the car didn't surge forward. It felt like driving through thick gelatin. The trees rushed in to fill the gap. Bark scraped against the doors, sparks flying from the friction. "We have to get out," Emily cried, pulling the lock pin repeatedly. It was jammed solid. The engine sputtered, the fuel light flashing red. They were out of gas, yet they hadn't moved an inch. The headlights flickered and died, plunging them into absolute darkness. Only the glow of the dashboard remained, casting eerie shadows on their faces. In the dark, the sounds were louder. Scratching, breathing, wet footsteps circling the car. Mark fumbled for his phone flashlight, but the beam was absorbed by the darkness after only a foot. The forest was eating the light. They were helpless, trapped in a metal box that was slowly being crushed. The heat rose, suffocating them. The end was coming not with a crash, but with a squeeze of the earth. In the dim light, Mark saw the truth. The road wasn't looping. The world was shrinking. The trees weren't moving around them. The space between them was vanishing. The forest was consuming the reality around the car. They weren't driving in circles. They were the last piece of territory left. The asphalt under them was the only solid ground remaining. Everything else had been reclaimed by the woods. Emily understood too. "It's eating the space," she whispered. The concept was madness, but the evidence was crushing them. The horizon was gone, replaced by a wall of trunks inches from the bumper. The sky was no longer above. It was a patch of green leaves pressing down on the roof. They were being digested into the landscape. The car was a virus, and the forest was the immune system closing in to eliminate it. There was no exit because there was no outside left. The shortcut had led them to the edge of existence, and the forest was erasing the map completely. The metal groaned under the pressure. The doors buckled inward, the glass cracking under the weight of the wood. Roots burst through the floorboards, wrapping around their ankles. They were cold and slimy, pulsing with life. Emily tried to kick them away, but more sprouted instantly. The car was becoming part of the tree. The air smelled of sap and old blood. Mark tried to scream, but the air was too thick to breathe. The dashboard was now covered in moss. The steering wheel was sprouting leaves. They were merging with the vehicle and the forest simultaneously. Time stopped completely. The flickering sky froze on a permanent twilight. There was no pain, only a sense of belonging. The forest didn't want to kill them. It wanted to keep them. They were becoming nutrients for the roots. The boundary between human and nature dissolved. The car was no longer a vehicle. It was a seed pod waiting to open. Their skin turned to bark, their hair to needles. Mark looked at Emily, but her face was changing. Her eyes were turning into knots of wood, her mouth sealing into a line of bark. He tried to reach for her, but his fingers were rooted to the seat. They were statues in a garden of monsters. The silence returned, heavier than before. The engine was gone, replaced by the sound of sap flowing. They were aware, trapped inside their own transforming bodies. They could feel the roots drinking from them, pulling their memories into the soil. Their lives were becoming rings in a tree trunk. The last thing Mark saw was the red ribbon on the oak tree, now tied around his own wrist. He was the tree now. The shortcut had ended. There was no home to return to. The road was gone, covered in leaves. The forest had won. It had added 2 more souls to its collection. The night was eternal here. Their human thoughts faded into photosynthesis. Morning came for the outside world, but not for the logging road. A new car approached the entrance. The GPS signal flickered. "Shortcut available," the voice said. The driver, a young man, smiled and turned the wheel. He didn't see the 2 new trees standing close together near the entrance. He didn't see the faces carved into the bark, screaming silently. The red ribbon fluttered on a branch, welcoming him in. The forest was hungry again. The space had healed where the car was crushed, ready for the next meal. The loop was reset. The physics were restored for the new victim, only to break again later. The woods kept their secret well. Mark and Emily were gone, yet they were everywhere. They were the wind in the leaves. They were the shadow on the path. The shortcut remained open, a trap waiting for the impatient. The forest always needed more territory. The cycle of consumption continued endlessly. The Valley of Whispers was not marked on any modern map, yet David knew exactly where to find it. His obsession with the legendary blue orchid had consumed his career, his marriage, and now his sanity. He trekked through the dense foliage, the air thick with a sweet, rotting perfume that clung to the back of his throat like syrup. The silence here was unnatural. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. Only the sound of his own boots crunching on dry leaves echoed loudly. He felt the weight of invisible eyes pressing against his skin, a primal warning that he was intruding on sacred ground. The trees leaned inward, their branches intertwining like fingers plotting a conspiracy against the intruder. David ignored the fear tightening his chest. Driven by the promise of fame and scientific glory, he pushed through a wall of thorns, tearing his jacket, and stumbled into a hidden clearing bathed in unnatural sunlight. There it stood, solitary and glowing. The flower pulsed with a faint blue light, breathing slowly. It wasn't just waiting to be photographed. It was waiting to be fed. The hook was set the moment he stepped into the light. The predator had sensed its prey. The ground beneath his boots felt soft, spongy, as if walking on flesh rather than earth. Every step sank slightly, leaving an imprint that filled with water immediately. The blue orchid was more beautiful than any photograph could ever capture. Its petals shimmered with an iridescent hue that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles, hypnotizing anyone who looked too long. David set up his tripod with trembling hands, his breath caught in his throat. The camera lens felt cold against his eye, framing the specimen perfectly within the viewfinder. He leaned in closer for a macro shot, desperate to capture the intricate details of the stamen. The air around the flower was warmer, humid like a greenhouse, smelling of ozone and nectar. He didn't notice the thorns hidden beneath the vibrant blue petals until it was too late. As he adjusted the focus, his finger brushed against the stem. A sharp pain pierced his skin, deeper than a normal prick, sending a shockwave up his arm. He jerked back, sucking the wound. A single drop of bright red blood fell from his finger, landing on the dark soil at the base of the plant. The ground seemed to hiss as the blood touched it. The flower's glow intensified for a split second. David wiped his hand on his pants, dismissing it as a clumsy mistake. He packed his gear, unaware that he had just signed a contract written in his own blood. The transaction was complete. The seed had been watered. The shadows around the clearing seemed to stretch toward the flower, protecting it. David felt a surge of adrenaline, the hunter becoming the hunted without knowing it. Back at his remote cabin, the pain refused to subside. It wasn't the throbbing of an infection. It was an itching, crawling sensation deep within the tissue. David cleaned the cut with alcohol, but the liquid sizzled as if hitting a hot pan. He bandaged it tightly, trying to ignore the warmth radiating from his hand. That night, sleep was impossible. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the woods outside. The sounds had changed. The wind sounded like whispering voices, calling his name. He woke up sweating, his heart racing. When he peeled off the bandage in the morning, the wound had not scabbed over. Instead, the skin around the cut had turned a pale green. He rubbed his eyes, convinced it was a trick of the light, but the color remained, spreading like a bruise. He tried to wash it off, scrubbing until his skin was raw, but the green was beneath the surface. It was moving. He could feel it shifting under his dermis, slow and deliberate. Panic began to set in. This was not biology he understood. The forest had followed him home, hidden inside his own veins. He looked at the mirror. His reflection looked tired, aged by years in a single night. The cabin felt colder, the walls closing in. He was alone with something growing inside him. By the third day, the green veins had reached his wrist. They pulsed in time with his heartbeat, but slightly out of sync, like a second rhythm competing within his arm. David stared at his limb in horror as the lines branched out, mimicking the structure of a leaf's vascular system. He tried to call for help, but the phone lines were dead. The isolation he had sought for privacy was now his prison. He wrapped his arm in dark cloth, hiding the mutation from view. The itching became unbearable, a burning sensation that felt like roots drilling into his bone. He stopped eating. The smell of food made him nauseous. Instead, he found himself standing by the window, facing the sun for hours. He craved the light. His skin felt tight, hardening like bark. When he touched his face, his cheek felt rough and textured. He was changing. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't sick, he was growing. The plant wasn't infecting him. It was rewriting his genetic code. He was becoming the soil. The horror wasn't death. It was transformation. He was losing his humanity cell by cell. The mirror showed a stranger, eyes yellowing like autumn leaves. He tried to scream, but his throat felt dry, filled with dust. Sleep became a distant memory. David spent his nights pacing the cabin, listening to the sounds coming from his own body. He could hear the soft tearing of fibers as the roots expanded inside him. It sounded like celery snapping, wet and organic. He screamed into the pillow to drown out the noise, but the sound was internal, vibrating in his skull. His movements became sluggish, stiff. His joints locked up, refusing to bend fully. He dragged his leg across the floor, leaving a trail of dirt that hadn't been there before. Where did the dirt come from? He looked down and saw soil leaking from his pores. He was decomposing while still alive. He tried to write a journal entry, but his fingers were too stiff to hold the pen. The handwriting was jagged, like branches scratching paper. He wrote one word: photosynthesis. He understood now. He didn't need food, he needed sun. He crawled to the window, dragging his heavy, wooden legs. The sun was setting. He felt his energy draining rapidly. Night was death. He needed the light to survive, but the light was finishing the process. The cabin was silent, except for the creaking of his own bones. Desperation drove him to the kitchen knife. He sat at the table, his arm bound tight above the elbow. He had to cut it out. He sterilized the blade with fire, his hands shaking violently. He made the incision along the green vein. He expected blood, but only sap oozed from the wound. It was thick, clear, and smelled of chlorophyll. No pain registered, only a numb pressure. He dug deeper, trying to sever the root connecting to his muscle. As soon as the blade cut through the fiber, the wound screamed. It was his voice, but distorted. The cut edges didn't bleed. They sprouted. Tiny green shoots emerged from the open flesh, writhing like worms. They grew rapidly, stitching the wound back together in seconds. He tried to cut again, slicing deeper into the meat. More sprouts erupted, tangling around the knife. He dropped the blade, horrified. The plant was defending itself. He was not the host, he was the garden. The infection was immune to steel. He fell to the floor, weeping, watching the green lines spread to his shoulder. There was no cure. There was only the harvest. The sap pooled on the table, glowing faintly in the dark. It looked alive, pulsing like a heart. David could no longer stand. His legs had fused together at the calves, the skin turning into rough bark. He dragged himself across the floor, leaving a trail of roots that anchored him to the wood. The cabin felt smaller, or perhaps he was growing larger. His vision blurred, shifting into spectrums he couldn't name. He could see the heat of the sun through the closed curtains. He could feel the moisture in the air. His mouth was sealed shut, lips fused into a hard line. He couldn't scream anymore. He tried to think of his family, but their faces were fading like old photographs. Memories were being composted to feed the growth. He felt a bud forming in his chest, pushing against his ribs. It was painful, a pressure that threatened to crack his sternum. He knew what was blooming inside him. The blue orchid was not external. It was internal. He was the vessel. He crawled to the door, trying to escape, but the roots had locked it from the inside. He was part of the house now. The forest had claimed its territory. His breath smelled of fresh rain and damp earth. He was becoming the landscape. The sun rose on the 5th day. David lay on the floor, completely still. His body was no longer human. It was a twisted sculpture of wood and vine, frozen in a pose of agony. His arms were branches, reaching toward the window. His hair had fallen out, replaced by leaves. The cabin was silent, filled with the scent of blooming flowers. The transformation was complete. There was no pain left, only a singular purpose. The organism that was once David understood its function. It was not to live, but to reproduce. The bud in his chest burst open, tearing through the wooden ribcage. A stem grew rapidly, coiling toward the light. It pushed through the roof of the cabin, shattering the shingles. The flower bloomed outside, magnificent and terrifying. It was larger than the one in the valley. It pulsed with a deep blue light, calling to the insects. But there were no insects here. The flower waited for something else. It waited for a traveler. The cycle was ready to begin again. The soil was rich now. The roots spread underground, connecting to the wider forest network. He was one with the woods. Inside the petals of the new flower, something moved. They were not stamens or pistils. They were eyes. Human eyes, wide and terrified, embedded in the center of the bloom. They looked around wildly, searching for help that would never come. David's consciousness was trapped inside the flower, aware but unable to move. He could see the forest around him, the same trees that had watched him die. He realized the truth now. The orchid wasn't a plant species. It was a graveyard. Every flower in the valley contained a soul that had been consumed. He was not the first, and he would not be the last. The eyes in the petals blinked in unison. They screamed silently, a psychic wave of despair that rippled through the woods. The beauty of the flower was a lure, designed to attract curious botanists. The blood was the key, the DNA the fertilizer. The forest was a collection of lost humans, blooming in eternal suffering. The horror was not the death, but the awareness after. He was the decoration of the woods. The wind moved the petals, making the eyes look alive. It was a gallery of the damned. Weeks later, a new car pulled up to the cabin. A young researcher stepped out, looking for the missing professor. He found the door open, the cabin overgrown. He saw the flower on the roof, glowing in the sunlight. He was mesmerized by its beauty. He climbed up to take a sample, ignoring the eyes watching him from the petals. He didn't see the thorns hidden beneath the blue hues. He reached out, his finger brushing the stem. A sharp pain pierced his skin. He jerked back, sucking the wound. A single drop of blood fell on the petals. The eyes in the flower widened. The flower leaned toward him, hungry. The researcher smiled, thinking he had made a discovery. He didn't know he was the next ingredient. The forest waited patiently. The roots underground stirred, sensing fresh meat. The cycle continued, endless and hungry. David's eyes watched from the bloom, warning the man silently. But the warning was invisible. The shortcut to fame was a path to becoming part of the landscape. The forest always needed more gardeners. The sun set, and the flower closed its petals, hiding the eyes until morning.